Let's go a bit deeper into the fat and talk about the two different kinds of fat, because not all fat is created equal. And you break this down in your book, the brown fat versus the subcutaneous white fat. So let's compare and contrast the two and talk about the differences.
Yeah. So when people think about fat, they think about white fat. And it doesn't matter the complexion of the person. White fat is white fat. So when you actually, peel back the skin, that's a gruesome way. If you pull out a piece of fat, I'll say it that way. If you do a little fat biopsy, like we do in the lab, if you look at the fat from a human and from a rodent, it is in fact a pretty bright white. And it's white because it's for the same reasons that the fat is white on a big steak. When you kind of look at the steak, what it's marbled with, the marbling or the fat is white. Fat is white for the most part. And that triglyceride in that animal meat is the same triglyceride that we have in our meat, if you will. And so it just is a white fat. The whiteness is a reflection, well, literally as the light's reflecting, of the type of fat that's in there. These triglycerides and the nature of the fat cell itself, which is in these fat cells that we call white fat cells, or white adipocytes, they are almost 100%, almost, so 98% is like if you look at within the body of the cell, almost all of it is one huge bubble of fat, what's called a lipid droplet. Then you have a little bit along the side, you have the mitochondria and the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the lysosome, the other little kind of organelles of the cell, the little parts within every cell that help the cell do its job. But it's kind of tucked up against the side. You don't even see them. In contrast, in brown adipocytes or brown fat cells, it looks, in fact, a little brown because when you look at the cell now, there are little pockets of fat droplets or lipid droplets, but then there's a lot of mitochondria intermingled with all the lipid droplets. And mitochondria have a reddish-brownish color, in part because of the iron and the other proteins that are in there. They have a kind of ruddy brownish complexion to them. And that's reflected in the brown adipocytes themselves. Again, because there's little pockets of fat and a lot of mitochondria interspersed within those fat droplets. The difference goes beyond appearance, and it goes into the level of function. White adipose tissue is designed to store energy. And thus, it's no surprise that it has a very low metabolic rate. It has the lowest metabolic rate of any cell we've ever tested in my lab. Super low metabolic rate. In contrast, brown fat with all their mitochondria have a very high metabolic rate, in fact, comparable to muscle cells. But interestingly, muscle cells have a high metabolic rate because they're active, they're doing work, they're contracting and relaxing and moving the body around. Well, what are fat cells doing? They're just sitting there. Brown fat cells have a high metabolic rate because they're chewing through fats and glucose. They're burning fats and glucose to create heat, which is kind of the ultimate sign of chemical inefficiency. So these are fat cells whose mitochondria don't care to get any work done in the cell, like contracting a muscle and relaxing it. They're just burning energy, burning nutrients to create heat. Now, there's something interesting about this. Through the lifespan of a human, when babies are born, they're very chubby. They're supposed to be chubby. It's healthy for the baby to be chubby. It's unhealthy if the baby's not chubby. One of the reasons the baby doesn't shiver, and babies don't shiver, they may have a little tremor, but they don't shiver when they're cold because they have a lot of brown fat around their whole body. A lot of their fat is brown fat. The baby is a little incubator. It's just burning through nutrients in order to create a lot of energy, a lot of heat energy. As we grow older, we have a shift. The baby has maybe kind of a 1-to-1. That's not quite, but let's just say a 1-to-1 brown to white. As we start to get older, the amount of brown fat we have starts to drop a lot. The amount of white fat we have starts to increase dramatically. And by the time we're adults, we pretty much just have a little bits of brown fat in this thoracic cavity and around the neck. Why it's there is a matter of speculation. Why not have it on our belly or our butt or our hips or anywhere else? It is a matter of speculation. My speculation is that as we get older, unlike the baby, when we need to get warm, we shiver. Well, we can shiver everywhere except here. There's no muscles up here to shiver. We don't have our muscles in our head start spasming like they do in the rest of our body. And so by having the brown fat around here, it's a very, very good way to heat the blood up as it's going up to the brain if we were cold. And indeed, cold exposure is a wonderful way to activate brown adipose tissue. It's a very well documented way of activating brown fat. Interestingly, people who have more brown fat, not surprisingly, are more resistant to gaining weight and developing type 2 diabetes. So I think it's a pretty important tool that we can leverage. We could say, how can I stimulate my brown fat? One is cold therapy. Another one is keeping insulin low. We published a paper a few years ago that found that when insulin was elevated, it slowed down the metabolic rate in the brown fat. It basically made brown fat start to behave more like white fat. In contrast, when ketones were elevated, which they can only do when insulin is down, ketones themselves actually help white fat start to behave more like brown fat. So it's pushing them the other way. So as esoteric and irrelevant as this kind of information may seem, it is in fact actionable. We can, in fact, manipulate our fat phenotype, one, through cold exposure from time to time, and second, keeping insulin low and ketones up.
And Ben, yourself, do you do some kind of cold therapy on a regular basis to stimulate the brown fat?
I do. Now, I wish I had kind of like a polar dip tub. You see all these kind of sexy tubs these days that are like designed for, there's one that like it gets cold on its own and makes like its own ice. I'm a professor. I can't afford that kind of thing. So what I will do after every workout, I'm lucky to be here on a campus. University has all kinds of resources, including a little sauna right next to the old man's locker room. And so I just go into the sauna for 15 minutes, which I love, and then I will go and take an as cold as that shower can get. I'll stay in that shower for about 5 minutes. It is not the same as full body immersion. I know that. It is not at all. But it's kind of the closest thing I can get to conveniently.
Let's stick on the fat topic a bit longer here and talk about the differences between visceral fat, so fat that's in around the organs, versus the subcutaneous fat. The differences and why, understanding the differences is so important.
Yeah. So the nature of the cells themselves, there's no difference. So a fat cell in the visceral space, like in the abdominal space, like within the abdominal cavity, is identical in function and form to the fat cells that are on the outside of the belly, the fat that you can pinch and jiggle. The difference is there's a slight difference in enzyme expression, and the bigger difference is the other cells that kind of move into the area, if you will. So with regards to enzymes and a little difference in function, despite what I just said, how they're identical in function, they're not quite, but they're very, very close. The similarities are much bigger than the differences. The fat cells in the visceral space are much more lipolytic. So at any given moment, they're releasing and breaking down fat at a much higher rate than fat cells in the subcutaneous fat tissue. So to say that another way, the body is always more determined to break down visceral fat than it is subcutaneous fat. Part of that might be the simple reality that within that kind of intra-abdominal visceral space, there's a finite amount of space. It is in fact kind of a walled-off little pocket of the body. And if we have too much fat there, that fat can physically start to impinge or physically compress the intestines and the kidneys and the liver and the blood flow to those tissues. And so it's not surprising that those fat cells are almost always determined to break themselves down and stay small. At the same time, the visceral fat occupies an interesting area with regards to blood flow, where when blood is flowing through the intestines and all the nutrients and things that blood is absorbing from the gut, it then moves into the visceral fat. So the visceral fat is kind of on the front lines of blood flow from the guts. And it is, and what might be coming from the guts may on occasion be kind of dirty or leaky. We might have things in that blood flow that we didn't want. And so having the visceral fat be a space that has a lot of immune cells in it makes sense for the sake of immunity and defending the body against unwanted pathogens coming in. But it also creates a potential problem where if we have a lot more visceral fat, that means we have a lot more of these immune cells. And immune cells secrete pro-inflammatory proteins at a very high rate. And so more visceral fat leads to more inflammation. And that's, once again, coming back to promoting insulin resistance and the complications that arise from it. In contrast, Subcutaneous fat has relatively very little immune cell population. It's just kind of mostly fat cells. But there's an important nuance here that might be missed. Immune cells are everywhere. Like macrophages, the kind of poster child of immune cells, and very important, they live in every tissue. So there's no macrophage organ, like there is a muscle organ or a fat organ or a brain organ. Macrophages aren't an organ like all white blood cells. They move into tissues. So you have macrophages in your muscle, you have macrophages in your brain, and you have macrophages in your fat cells. They're supposed to be there. They serve an important job in all of these tissues. But in the visceral fat, we have a lot more of them naturally. And if we have more visceral fat, then we have a lot more macrophages. And that starts contributing to a higher inflammation load throughout the body.
So, knowing what we know about visceral fat and how it can lead to inflammation, do we have any control over minimizing the amount of fat in that area? Or is it more just, I have a weight challenge right now and I need to get my weight down as a whole? Or can we kind of target that area and bring the amount of fat there down?
Yeah. So, visceral fat is known to grow with fructose consumption and alcohol consumption, but it's not that common that people are really going overboard on alcohol. It is much more common that they're going overboard on fructose. And this is a very, very important point, and it's been very well documented in humans. We know from human studies that if you give one group of people a drink that is made up of fructose, like a fructose water drink, another group is getting a glucose water drink. These are two carbohydrates that have they're monosaccharides, the simplest form. Fructose isn't. Fructose is. Fructose, both monosaccharides. And they're isocaloric, so there's no difference in their calorie consumption. They're drinking the exact same amount of calories. And the group that's drinking the fructose solutions are gaining more fat selectively in their visceral fat and relatively less in their subcutaneous fat. That is the exact opposite compared with the glucose drinking group, who is growing more subcutaneous fat and relatively less visceral. So we can absolutely contribute and or reduce the visceral fat that we have by changing our diet. And the low-hanging fruit is just eat less fructose, or I should say drink less fructose. When we're drinking sugary sodas or we're drinking fruit juice that is pure fructose and water, don't do it. So control the fructose. And that's not the same as eating fruit. You'd have to eat a hell of a lot of fruit to get enough fructose to start changing visceral fat accumulation. So, that's not the concern. I'm not declaring war on fruit, but I am declaring war on fruit juice and other forms of, highly accessible and highly consumable fructose, like sugary sodas and fruit juice.
And if somebody's concerned that they might have too much visceral fat, well, for one, is there a healthy amount? And two, is there a way to go about assessing how much of that fat you have in that area to get a baseline and then maybe work on it and retest down the line?
Yeah, so it is healthy. We need to have it because it plays an important role in our immune function, like, kind of scavenging any pathogens from the blood right as it's coming from the guts. So I think it serves a very purpose. I think, it's designed to be there, and I don't think we'd ever want to try to get rid of it. But there are a way to kind of get an idea of whether a person has too much. There's not a perfect way to do it at home. There are ways to do it, of course, through MRIs and DEXA scans in a clinical situation. But the closest someone could come would be probably the waist to hip ratio. And that is as simple as it sounds, where you measure the biggest part of the belly around the belly button, and then you measure the biggest part of the butt and hips. And if that ratio, I don't remember the exact cutoffs, but in a guy, it should be, around 1, maybe around 0.9. And then in a woman, it should be closer to around 0.7 or so. So a woman should be bigger around her hips and butt than she is around her belly by, a pretty decent margin. And a guy, where we store our fat a little differently naturally, we should be closer to around 0.9, so a little closer to even. As that ratio is getting higher, so if it's above 0.7 in a woman and above 0.9 in a man, that starts to reflect an imbalance. that the person is probably storing more fat in the visceral space and less fat in the subcutaneous space, because fat around the butt and hips is 100% subcutaneous. Fat around the belly can be a mix of visceral and subcutaneous. But again, if that ratio is getting higher, the waist to hip, if that ratio is getting bigger, that's a sign that there is more adipose within the visceral space.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
If a person's following kind of those 4 pillars, fasting, control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, they will move the needle and the insulin resistance will be gone, usually in weeks, in months perhaps.